Hi. At last summer's Asilomar, I talked about Revelation at that time, and I elaborated on an argument that was taking place between John the prophet, who 2,000 years ago receives a revelation from Christ. He writes it down in a letter and sends it to the churches. And by the way, this talk is really very beautifully summed up on your handout, so you don't need to pay attention to your handout. You can just listen to me. So John the prophet has this revelation from Christ 2,000 years ago. He writes it down and he sends it to the churches in Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey. And he's having an argument with three specific opponents or groups that are in some of these 7 churches. These opponents are severely criticized by John for 2 things: for encouraging fellow believers to eat meat sacrificed but for idols at pagan worship, and for practicing fornication. And that is code language for association of any kind with Roman culture. My focus last summer was on one of these opponents, who John assigns the name of Jezebel. I don't have a big enough ear for this thing. Christ comes to John in a vision. And according to John, Christ says, "Beware, I am throwing Jezebel on a bed. And those who commit adultery with her, I am throwing into great distress unless they repent of her doings, and I will strike her children, her followers, dead." That's very harsh, isn't it? The fact that John has to specifically refute this woman means that her voice in the church is powerful and that it's different than his. And John mentions dismissively that this woman calls herself a prophet. And John also calls himself a prophet. Because they are both in the churches, and I think we forget that Jezebel is in the church, he's writing to the churches. And because they both have followers, it's very possible that they both have prophetic merit. So my task this morning is to lay out for you this argument, because it's going to set the stage for both Sandy and Maddie's talks that follow. And then you're going to take the ideas and issues that are raised in these talks and explore them this afternoon in the workshops that after lunch. These issues are relevant to us today because they, like we too, are working to negotiate our place and our church's place in relationship to a very dominant culture. And in the churches then and in the churches, as we clearly know today, there are very different ideas about what that relationship should look like. Do we not agree with that? So what is this argument in the churches all about? To explain, I'm going to first stand in the shoes of John, the prophet here, and then I'm going to stand in Jezebel's shoes. And I'm turning John and Jezebel into archetypes of 2 very different early Christian perspectives found in the church. And how I depict these characters will be based on the content in Revelation for John and on the content in Paul's letters in how I represent Jezebel. And as well as very current scholarly research. So we're going to begin with the perspective of John. This is his prayer shawl. Here we go. It's the year 90, when Revelation was probably likely written. And here's John. I'm a Jew. I'm a supreme monotheist and very much living in the light of my Shema from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. I am also a Jew that believes that Jesus is the Messiah. It's been 20 years since I was forced to flee Jerusalem. That's when the Romans came in 70 and leveled my city and my temple, and I had to flee. I'm very grateful to Turkey as my place of refuge. I'm very grateful to have a place of refuge, but it hasn't been easy. It's a very pagan world outside of Jerusalem. And Turkey in particular is the center not only of the worship of the many pagan gods, but the worship of Caesar as gods. That was the center in Turkey. In fact, the city of Pergamum, which is one of the churches I write to, is in Pergamum, boasts a temple to the god Zeus. It's an abomination of a temple. I call it the Satan's throne. And then there are the endless festivals, and at every festival you sacrifice meat, and people eat this sacrificed meat to the gods. You can't turn around in Turkey without bumping into a temple or a god or a festival. I'm in exile now on an island off of Turkey because of my public witness that Jesus is the Messiah. The authorities view me as a threat to the city because I refuse to pledge allegiance to their gods. I can bear that persecution because of my faith in Jesus as the Messiah, but I cannot bear what is happening in the churches, and I must write you churches today about that. It has to do with that rogue, Paul, who came through Turkey 25 years ago. He's responsible for bringing all these Gentiles into the church. These Gentiles are newcomers, and they came and they took charge and instituted all their practices, irrespective of 500 years of Israel's morality and practices. But most egregiously, these Gentiles compromise with Roman rule and practices. The very Romans who crucified my Messiah and leveled my beloved city. I, the prophet, am charged to keep God's people holy, unpolluted, set apart. And I write you, the churches, to boycott absolutely the Roman culture and economy. We are a countercultural community. We cannot forget our otherness, what makes us distinct and set apart and really distinctly recognizable. Withdraw absolutely from the corruptions of this world, or you will become profane yourselves. Do not follow the lead of the Laodicean church, one of those churches I am writing, with their buy-in to the good life. The church is like a banquet where Jesus is invited as a guest, and he is given something to drink that is so tepid that he spits it out of his mouth. Tepid is something that loses its appeal by conforming to the air around it. The temperature, it conforms to that temperature. And this is the condition of the Laodicean community, you see. They have become indistinguishable from their surrounding environment. Lukewarm now, burn later. Come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins. Only by the very strangeness and otherness of our Christian way of life can we stand out, can we be vivid, can we be visible, can we make our case for Christ. I praise those of you who are faithful amidst your suffering and your sacrifices and your poverty, and radically hold fast to Christ's name and never deny your faith. I say to those Gentile members of the church who are comfortably in bed with the regime, beware. Rome is not neutral and benign, but under God's judgment and in the process of self-destruction. Get right or get left. Get right, even if it means your martyrdom. For martyrdom is necessary for bringing in the new age. We, the saints, must be faithful unto death. We, the saints, conquer as Jesus did by bearing witness unto death. By bearing witness to God unto death, not just any witness. We, the saints, are ruled by the slaughtered Lamb who purchases us with his blood. And we will be rewarded when God's kingdom comes, which is soon. This is a war. But it's not just between God's people and Rome, but it is against all the diabolical powers and systems that resist the one true God, that deflect us from that true God. And my letter is really about unmasking these powers, these so-called powers. You know, the name of my letter is Revelation. The Greek is apocalypse, and that means to unmask, to uncover. My letter reveals or uncovers these powers as a fraud. And this uncovering will include much suffering. These are the birth pangs of the new age to come, when all the purging is over, and justice is served. All will be governed by the throne of God and his Christ, the Lamb. The gospel was never spread by those seeking first a guarantee of safety or comfort. The call for sacrifice, for the cross, is essential for the birthing of a new messianic age. Otherwise, the values of that new age won't be any different than the old age. Only through radical reliance will we experience the coming of the kingdom. Jezebel, she calls me weak. That's a term that she got from Paul, because I resist any adulteration of our tradition. But it is the treatment, it is a testament to your strength that you, the saints, hold fast to your convictions and faith. It is Jezebel who is weak because she is weak with pride, because she has such ease in pagan things. More than anything, she's the one that needs repentance. This will purge her of the world's conventions and corruptions and power structures, but she has refused to repent, to be purchased by the blood of the Lamb. We must keep the entrance bar of the churches high, making it only for those who are worthy. Any loosening of the Torah requirements opens the gates to permissiveness, and watered down faith. Our youth are leaving us now because we look and act like everybody else. We have made it hard for them to discern what makes us a singular people. So that's John. Let's hear the perspective from Jezebel on the other side. I'm going to put on my Jezebel prayer shawl. Okay. I'm the prophet Junia. John has written a letter to the churches where he calls me Jezebel. He associates me with the most negative woman in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Jewish scriptures. Remember, Jezebel was the foreign wife of King Ahab of Israel, and her gods went up against Elijah's gods at Mount Carmel, and you know who won? And she really lost. She was divinely condemned and killed. That's what John calls me. He severely criticizes my church for tolerating me, that woman. John sees my participation in Roman culture and Roman practices as contaminating the church and making God angry. In his mind, this makes me a cosmic threat, a tool of Satan. In John's letter to the churches, I was not given a voice. So I'm going to take my veil off and tell my story. I am what John the prophet would call a Gentile. And in the language of that means literally to a Jew, a Gentile is anyone who is not a Jew. So I am an other. I am an outsider also, because I am outside of John's camps of conviction. Hold on for 1 second. The problem is that many of the folks in the church are outside of his camp of conviction as well. I'm not alone. I am a long-time Gentile convert. I was brought into the Thyatira church 25 years ago when Paul came through Turkey and introduced me to Christ. Paul could speak to the Gentiles because he was born in Turkey like us. He was comfortable associating with the pagan world. I remember when there was a Jewish group that followed Paul all around Turkey as Paul went and preached Christ, telling us Gentiles that we had to first become Jews before we could become a follower of Jesus as the Messiah. This Jerusalem faction saw themselves as gatekeepers, and this made Paul very angry, even though I was amazed that Paul himself, as a Jew, did not require me to first become a Jew to be part of the Jesus movement. I'm a woman. I didn't have to worry about being circumcised, at least. I still have not, even today, put one foot through a synagogue door. I've not walked into a synagogue. Paul opened another door for us to the grace and power of God as seen through the Messiah, through his Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ. Along with many in our church, we read the letters of Paul together to remind us of his wise counsel. John accuses me of beguiling the members of the church to eat food sacrificed to idols. Now, Paul never required the Gentile converts to not follow the Jewish dietary rules. I admit I still do eat idol meat sacrificed. I buy it at the market. And being out there and being a part of eating idol meat, and it keeps me in touch with my family, my pagan family, and my pagan friends. Even Paul said that this wasn't a problem. Paul had counseled the Corinthian Gentiles. He said, go ahead and eat meat sacrificed to idols. Because he said, we know that no idol really exists, and that there is no God but the one God. Paul had explained, food isn't going to bring you any closer to God. This is, I think, in Corinthians. He said, just remember that God doesn't care whether we eat idol meat or not. He said, we're no better off if we do eat it, and no worse off if we don't. I find John's radical posture towards the empire rather strange and excessive. Nor would I celebrate its total destruction, which he forecasts in his letter. I don't see myself as a complete outsider to the Roman culture and practices. Paul had counseled the very Roman church to be respectable members of society and to obey authorities. I can live in this imperial world, but not of it. I try each day, as our Lord directed, to sort out what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. John is asking us to make huge economic sacrifices. To not eat idol meat is to cut ourselves off from all trade guilds and business associations in the Roman world. It's almost impossible to make a living without some complicity with these basic civic structures of society. Besides, I brought into the church fold many of my pagan friends and some of my family. And I've been able to deflect any kind of ignorance, any kind of persecution from the church because they know me. I call these my unradical acts. The modesty and distinguishing affections that allow others to witness the nature of Christ in how I live. As Paul recommended, I take care not to eat idol meat in front of my Jewish fellow church members, because this would defile their consciences. Paul said we need to take care that our liberty doesn't become a stumbling block for other members of the church. Those weak, which is Paul's word, are the Jewish followers of Christ in the church, like John, scandalized by idol meat as unclean and abominable. The Jewish members of the church feel that such a practice fails the test of really true radical fidelity to the one God. I understand that. In return, I ask the Jewish members of the church to not burden us with onerous requirements like these dietary rules or circumcision or complete separation from our pagan friends and family. We are a holy people that needs to be out there as prudent members of society. mixing with Rome's social and economic and political structures, talking the language of the market, ministering and preaching at pagan festivals, at healing centers, at coffee shops, prisons, introducing contemporary music in our worship service, or using the modern Latin translations of Scripture in our service. This is not an encroachment of the culture. This is reaching out to our culture, and especially reaching out to the youth. If our membership bar is too high, they feel unworthy and leave us. We cannot be so apart from that we define ourselves as over and against others. Let me quote Paul to my opponent, John. To the Jews, I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, to win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I became all things to all people, so that I might I became all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. And I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I might share in its blessing. That's 1 Corinthians 9. I see clearly that our openness to outsiders, our adaptation of Jesus' message to speak to the Roman world, and this is exactly what Paul did in negotiating his message to the Roman world, that is what will guarantee the future of Christianity. Without this openness, our community of faithful people will remain a hidden Jewish remnant, and our Christ will be inaccessible to so many. So, now, I am Helen. And I live in the 21st century. And as most of you might guess, I have a lot of empathy with Junia's perspective, perhaps more than John's, but you'll wait and see. When I was in graduate seminary, I was really excited to be learning new ways of worship, new music, new translations, new everything. And I hit a brick wall when I brought these back to my church to try on. And I was kind of like those Gentiles that came charging in with all these new ideas and new practices, irrespective of the church's long-held traditions and things that were very dear to them. So it was a kind of a two-way street there. But I remember clearly a conversation with a very dear member of our church telling me that everyone that went to that seminary turned out just like me. What does a community do with the Johns and Junias in their church? Here's a story that I found helpful, and maybe it'll be a good basis for conversation this afternoon. Annie Lamott is a Christian writer that I really enjoy, and she tells of having her tonsils removed when she was 21. The following week, swallowing still hurt so much she could barely open her mouth for a straw. So she calls the nurse and says, "I want more painkillers, I've run out." And the nurse said, "No." She said, "Go out and buy a pack of gum and chew it vigorously." And she went, "Humph." So the nurse explained that when we have a wound in the body, that the muscles cramp around it to protect it, to keep it from more violation or infection. The cramping is supposed to keep it from getting hurt in the same place again and from keeping foreign substances out. To cramp means to contract or constrain. Muscles that cramp and tighten around a wound keep it from being mobile, keep those muscles bound, keep the structures bound, restricting freedom, so on. It's kind of like Annie's jaw. But Annie now needed to use those muscles so that the muscles could get back to doing what they're supposed to be doing. So she went out and bought some gum and began to chew with great hostility and skepticism. And the first bites, there was this ripping sensation in the back of her throat, but within minutes, the pain was gone permanently. That's her story. Perhaps, I'm going to go ahead and make a metaphorical connection to our church body, because we know that amidst all our joys and triumphs as a community, that we have sometimes wounded each other as we work things out together because of our frustrations or our fears or our disappointments. And sometimes the response to these wounds can be the shutting down of flexibility, as muscles cramp around those wounds and create knots or camps of conviction that won't budge. The challenge is how then to work as a community to exercise our spiritual muscle, to get those muscles back and working again with freely and coordination. If I could keep going with this metaphor for one more leg of the journey here. As we saw from Lamotte's story, that when things freeze up, that sometimes there is pain that is necessary to get things moving again. And this is actually what physical therapy is all about to an extent. And I'm not endorsing physical therapy or dismissing it, but I think there's something instructive to learn here. Because normally we try to avoid pain in our bodies and in our churches. We do everything to avoid that pain because we think pain is about inharmony and dysfunction, that we're doing something wrong. But pain in physical therapy is sometimes, not always, but sometimes a sign that we're doing something right. And for the doing part, I'm not talking about brute human will pushing our way to where we want to go, but doing or moving persistently, prayerfully in the direction we need to go, and through that pain and resistance, because we know we have a divine right for mobility, flexibility, and normalcy. And as in physical therapy, at some point you reach a threshold. You reach a breakthrough where the pain is gone and harmony is achieved. Now, God tells us that anything is possible, that a valley of dead bones can rise up instantaneously at the command of a prophet. Don't you love that image from Ezekiel? But I think particularly for communities of faith, taking the human footsteps that are necessary to get moving again, to come together, to restore the bones, the structures, and the muscles all working in coordination, can be just as miraculous, can be just as much God's doing. The Gospel of Thomas says, "If two make peace with one another in this single household, they will say to the mountain, 'Go away,' and it will move." I love that. These human footsteps to make peace in our churches are the exercise of our spiritual muscle. The resuscitation of those Christly qualities, the resuscitation of those bones, put to work through any kind of pain around our wounds, any kind of cramping, and it's a way of massaging away those knots of conviction. But in Revelation, peacemaking and healing of church function doesn't seem to be what this book is about. But we're going to get back to that. But love is not a word that's used very often in this book. It's one of the reasons why they think maybe the author of the gospel is different than John. Rather, John works to purify by excluding the Jezebel camp, by isolating her. His rhetoric only stigmatizes and justifies violence. I found when I taught this book at Principia College, that I had a really hard time. I had to really work with the students so that they wouldn't just close the book and wash their hands of it. They were really turned off by John's judgmental message and the impact that it could have on real people, on real communities, if taken quite literally. My task was to get them to step back and look for some kind of ultimate meaning here, because we know that there's something going on if John the prophet is here revealing something to us. And we owe it to our New Testament and our Bible and this book to dig deeper as critical thinkers to get to that point. So however imperfectly John as a prophet is in working this idea in the presence of the book of Revelation, it does suggest that he still has something to tell us. A prophet's vocation is to be so one with God, so close to God, that he or she is instantly alerted when something is out of alignment. Okay? When something or some people have been co-opted by a lesser reality. Okay? From John's perspective, it is important to keep his community aligned with God, unadulterated, because he knows that the purer and the more radical the member's faith, the more powerful and immediate will be the coming of the kingdom. And John's prophetic task is to judge or denounce what is business as usual. And of course, John does this in spades with cycle after cycle after endless cycle of beasts and locusts and fires and storms and earthquakes and all kinds of other devastation. At the end of the book of Revelation, 2 books are opened in the courthouse, the heavenly courtroom. And in traditional apocalyptic end-time mode, one of those books is the book of judgment that records all the deeds of all humans. And standing before this book, everyone is judged according to what they've done or not done. As a result, not only the dragons and the beasts are thrown into the lake of fire, but anyone with the mark of the beast on their forehead. And in Revelation, that means anyone who has associated with Rome, which would include Junias, the Junias or the Jezebels in the church, all those like her, as well as the kings of the earth who traded with Rome. They ended up in the lake of fire. A moral universe requires that evil be punished by a righteous God. But John doesn't leave us with this picture because he is a prophet. He knows he must fulfill the second requirement that a prophet has to go through. Because after the prophet excoriates and judges the people, he doesn't leave them in that spiritual vacuum. He has to then now spiritually re-energize the people of God with a vision that reminds them of who they are and why they are and what they're about. And this is where it gets really interesting and deeper in Revelation, because John turns a surprising corner at the end of Revelation. For against everything that we might expect, John modifies his own apocalyptic traditional judgment that separates and divides to portray right next to it a radically inclusive new earth where God makes all things new. Not all new things, but all things from the beginning new. This new earth found in the last 2 chapters is called the New Jerusalem. And here we find a city teeming with humanity, where everybody is related to everybody else, and everybody is in direct relationship with God, direct fellowship with God. Yeah, I guess if you think he's a fellow, maybe, We know this because in the New Jerusalem there is no temple. So God is no longer cloistered in this little holy of holy box in the middle of a temple that's surrounded by walls. God is now out and about among the people walking the streets. And John tells us this. He says, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples." I love that, plural, peoples. "And God himself will be with them. Nor will there be a temple wall or a city wall that separates men and women, Gentiles and Jews, liberals and conservatives, Johns and Junias. The New Jerusalem has one wall, but it has 12 gates in the wall that are always open." Instead of a vision of sectarian and ideological separateness, John envisions New Jerusalem gates eternally open. John gives us this ultimate vision of God's utter sovereignty as reconciling and redeeming and life-giving, not destructive and exclusive. Now, why would John the seer, writing to the 7 churches, present 2 visions side by side, so opposite? One is a judging, wrathful God with terrible consequences for people, and a God of grace and universal salvation and a New Jerusalem. John intentionally holds this saving and judging side by side throughout the book of Revelation because of the way he structures it, the way he wrote it. Throughout Revelation, amidst the cycle after cycle of this wrath and judgment, John interjects at key points these visions of the throne room, where we see God on the throne and Christ sitting at God's right hand. This tells us that what ought to be already is. What ought to be is not Caesar ruling, but Jesus as Lord. What ought to be is what is already a done deal in heaven. And John says that this must take place soon because God reigns. This is what I find so profound about Revelation, the inevitability of this era to come. There is not one iota of doubt in John's mind that the kingdom will come. And nor in Mary Baker Eddy's mind, because I love this prophetic statement of hers. She says, the broadcast powers of evil so conspicuous today show themselves in the materialism and sensualism of the age, struggling against the advancing spiritual era. Notice that it's not spirituality struggling against materialism. It's materialism struggling against the inevitable advancing spiritual era. That's the way it looks here too. So, knowing the certainty of all this, how do we behave in the meantime? And Walter Wink, who's a wonderful Bible scholar and peace activist, I think explains it well. He says, faith does not wait for God's sovereignty to be established on earth. It behaves as if that sovereignty already holds full sway. And according to the last 2 chapters of Revelation, what that sovereignty looks like is a vision of radical inclusiveness when all things are made new. So I conclude here by making a case that John is really calling us to behave in accord with that ultimate vision that must include reconciliation and inclusion. Inclusion of the Johns and Junias. No one need to be left out, shelved, or left languishing in the lake of fire, except maybe the beast and the dragon. And remember those kings of the earth? John, in these last 2 chapters, specifically includes these kings in the New Jerusalem. They come bringing their gifts and their glory to the kingdom. Surely Junia can bring her gifts too. And remember the heavenly courtroom that had 2 books open, and one was the book of judgment. The other is the book of life. The book of life. And Paul best describes that book of life when he declares that the names of his fellow laborers in the Philippian church are found in the book of life. That's Philippians 4. Paul even includes in the book of life 2 women in the church who are having an argument with each other. Paul says, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you and also my loyal companion, help these women. For they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Note, Paul doesn't isolate the women. He's trying to reconcile them, and he's gathering the whole church around them to do that, to bring about healing. Surely Junia, as co-worker in the Thyatira church for 25 years, working in the legacy of Paul, belongs also in the New Jerusalem. The last thing that is thrown into the lake of fire is death. It is with the death of death. It's the death of death. And with that death of death, all things in Jerusalem were made new. That's what they were born again. Resurrection becomes a fact of life in the New Jerusalem. And this is certainly true for the kings that were in that lake of fire. They came back into this New Jerusalem. So too the Junias. So this is a question we can explore today. What does it look like to behave as if God's sovereignty already holds full sway? Revelation gives us this ultimate vision of reconciliation and resurrection hope. It is a vision of a community planted by the waters with the tree of life. Remember that in the book of Revelation? The tree of life is in its midst. This healing brought forth the kings of the earth, and certainly it will bring forth the churches into this fold. This healing tree reminds me of Robert Frost's poem, The Swinger of Birches. Love that poem. Where he speaks of bending those trees to take the stiffness out of them, yet not carrying the tree away. So I wrote this, to finish this talk, I wrote this prayer poem of the tree of life in the midst of our New Jerusalem church. May our church lives teach us how to adapt to the winds of change, yet keep our foundations or roots well grounded. May our presence be a cool refuge for others, a bounty of shade in a season of sun. Each leaf's exhale a blessing. May our limbs fearlessly reach up to the heavens, holding up under ponderous squalls, yet delighting in the most inconsequential of featherweights. And underneath our trunks, vital sap course, yet each surge a life force of renewal. And whether our style be bonsai or redwood or olive tree or baobab or birch, may we be there for climbing when Zacchaeus seeks a better view. Thank you.